Chapter 68, Part 3 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 68, Part 3. The generosity of the Christian princes was cold and tardy. But in the first apprehension of a siege, Constantine had negotiated, in the isles of the Archipelago, the Morea, and Sicily, the most indispensable supplies. As early as the beginning of April, 5 great ships, equipped for merchandise and war, would have sailed from the harbor of Chios, had not the wind blown obstinately from the north. One of these ships bore the Imperial flag, the remaining 4 belonging to the Genoese, and they were laden with wheat and barley, with wine, oil, and vegetables, and above all with soldiers and mariners, for the service of the capital. After a tedious delay, a gentle breeze, and on the second day a strong gale from the south, carried them through the Hellespont and the Propontis. But the city was already invested by sea and land, and the Turkish fleet, at the entrance of the Bosphorus, was stretched from shore to shore, in the form of a crescent, to intercept, or at least to repel, these bold auxiliaries. The reader who has present to his mind the geographical picture of Constantinople will conceive and admire the greatness of the spectacle. The 5 Christian ships continued to advance with joyful shouts, and a full press both of sails and oars, against a hostile fleet of 300 vessels, and the rampart, the camp, the coasts of Europe and Asia were lined with innumerable spectators, who anxiously awaited the event of this momentous succor. At the first view that event could not appear doubtful. The superiority of the Moslems was beyond all measure or account, and in a calm their numbers and valor must inevitably have prevailed. But their hasty and imperfect navy had been created, not by the genius of the people, but by the will of the sultan. In the height of their prosperity, the Turks have acknowledged that, if God had given them the earth, he had left the sea to the infidels; and a series of defeats, a rapid progress of decay, has established the truth of their modest confession. Except 18 galleys of some force, the rest of their fleet consisted of open boats, rudely constructed and awkwardly managed, crowded with troops and destitute of cannon; and since courage arises in a great measure from the consciousness of strength, the bravest of the Janizaries might tremble on a new element. In the Christian squadron 5 stout and lofty ships were guided by skilful pilots, and manned with the veterans of Italy and Greece, long practised in the arts and perils of the sea. Their weight was directed to sink or scatter the weak obstacles that impeded their passage. Their artillery swept the waters, their liquid fire was poured on the heads of the adversaries, who, with the design of boarding, presumed to approach them, and the winds and waves were always on the side of the ablest navigators. In this conflict the Imperial vessel, which had almost been overpowered, was rescued by the Genoese; but the Turks, in a distant and closer attack, were twice repulsed with considerable loss. Mohammed himself sat on horseback on the beach to encourage their valor, by his voice and presence, by the promise of reward, and by fear more potent than fear of the enemy. The passions of his soul, and even the gestures of his body, seemed to intimate the actions of the combatants, and as if he had been the lord of nature, he spurred his horse with a fearless and impotent effort into the sea. His loud reproaches and the clamors of the camp urged the Ottomans to a third attack, more fatal and bloody than the 2 former, and I must repeat, though I cannot credit the evidence of Phranza, who affirms from their own mouth that they lost above 12,000 men in the slaughter of the day. They fled in disorder to the shores of Europe and Asia, while the Christian squadron, triumphant and unhurt, steered along the Bosphorus, and securely anchored within the chain of the harbor. In the confidence of victory, they boasted that the whole Turkish power must have yielded to their arms; but the admiral, or Captain Bashaw, found some consolation from a painful wound in his eye, by representing that accident as the cause of his defeat. Baltha Ogli was a renegade of the race of the Bulgarian princes. His military character was tainted with the unpopular vice of avarice, and under the despotism of the prince or people, misfortune is a sufficient evidence of guilt. His rank and services were annihilated by the displeasure of Mohammed. In the royal presence, the captain Bashal was extended on the ground by 4 slaves, and received 100 strokes with a golden rod. His death had been pronounced, and he adorned the clemency of the sultan, who was satisfied with the milder punishment of confiscation and exile. The introduction of this supply revived the hopes of the Greeks, and accused the supineness of their western allies. Amidst the deserts of Anatolia and the rocks of Palestine, the millions of the Crusaders had buried themselves in a voluntary and inevitable grave; but the situation of the Imperial city was strong against her enemies, and accessible to her friends; and a rational and moderate armament of the maritime states might have saved the relics of the Roman name, and maintained a Christian fortress in the heart of the Ottoman empire. Yet this was the sole and feeble attempt for the deliverance of Constantinople. The more distant powers were insensible to its danger, and the ambassador of Hungary, or at least of Huniades, resided in the Turkish camp, to remove the fears and to direct the operations of the sultan. It was difficult for the Greeks to penetrate the secret of the divan; yet the Greeks are persuaded that a resistance so obstinate and surprising had fatigued the perseverance of Mahomet. He began to meditate a retreat, and the siege would have been speedily raised, if the ambition and jealousy of the second vizier had not opposed the perfidious advice of Khalil Basha, who still maintained a secret correspondence with the Byzantine court. The reduction of the city appeared to be hopeless, unless a double attack could be made from the harbor as well as from the land; but the harbor was inaccessible, and impenetrable chain was now defended with 8 large ships, more than 20 of a smaller size, and several galleys and sloops; and instead of forcing this barrier, the Turks might apprehend a naval sally, and a second encounter in the open sea. In this perplexity, the genius of Mahomet conceived and executed a plan of a bold and marvellous cast, of transporting by land his lighter vessels and military stores from the Bosphorus into the higher part of the harbor. The distance is about 10 miles, the ground is uneven, and was overspread with thickets; and as the road must be opened behind the suburb of Galata, their free passage or total destruction must depend on the option of the Genoese. But these selfish merchants were ambitious of the favor of being the last devoured, and the deficiency of art was supplied by the strength of obedient myriads. A level way was covered with a broad platform of strong and solid planks, and to render them more slippery and smooth, they were anointed with the fat of sheep and oxen. 80 light galleys and brigantines of 50 and 30 oars were disembarked on the Bosphorus shore, arranged successively on rollers, and drawn forth by the power of men and pulleys. 2 guides or pilots were stationed at the helm and the prow of each vessel. The sails were unfurled to the winds, and the labor was cheered by song and acclamation. In the course of a single night, this Turkish fleet painfully climbed the hill, steered over the plain, and was launched from the declivity into the shallow waters of the harbor, far above the molestation of the deeper vessels of the Greeks. The real importance of this operation was magnified by the consternation and confidence which it inspired; but the notorious, unquestionable fact was displayed before the eyes, and is recorded by the pens of the 2 nations. A similar stratagem had been repeatedly practised by the ancients. The Ottoman galleys, I must again repeat, should be considered as large boats; and if we compare the magnitude and the distance, the obstacles and the means, the boasted miracle has perhaps been equalled by the industry of our own times. As soon as Mahomet had occupied the upper harbor with the fleet and army, he constructed in the narrowest part a bridge, or rather mole, of 50 cubits in breadth, and 100 in length. It was formed of casks and hogsheads, joined with rafters, linked with iron, and covered with a solid floor. On this floating battery he planted one of his largest cannon, while the 80 galleys with troops and scaling ladders approached the most accessible side, which had formerly been stormed by the Latin conquerors. The indolence of the Christians has been accused for not destroying these unfinished works; but their fire, by a superior fire, was controlled and silenced; nor were they wanting in a nocturnal attempt to burn the vessels as well as the bridge of the sultan. His vigilance prevented their approach; their foremost galiots were sunk or taken. 40 youths, The bravest of Italy and Greece were inhumanly massacred at his command; nor could the emperor's grief be assuaged by the just, though cruel, retaliation of exposing from the walls the heads of 260 Mussulman captives. After a siege of 40 days, the fate of Constantinople could no longer be averted. The diminutive garrison was exhausted by a double attack. The fortifications, which had stood for ages against hostile violence, were dismantled on all sides by the Ottoman cannon. Many breaches were opened, and near the gate of St. Romanus 4 towers had been levelled with the ground. For the payment of his feeble and mutinous troops, Constantine was compelled to despoil the churches with the promise of a 4-fold restitution, and his sacrilege offered a new reproach to the enemies of the Union. A spirit of discord impaired the remnant of the Christian strength. The Genoese and Venetian auxiliaries asserted the preeminence of their respective service, and Justiniani and the great duke, whose ambition was not extinguished by the common danger, accused each other of treachery and cowardice. During the siege of Constantinople, the words of peace and capitulation had been sometimes pronounced, and several embassies had passed between the camp and the city. The Greek emperor was humbled by adversity, and would have yielded to any terms compatible with religion and royalty. The Turkish sultan was desirous of sparing the blood of his soldiers, still more desirous of securing for his own use the Byzantine treasures, and he accomplished a sacred duty in presenting to the Gabours the choice of circumcision, of tribute, or of death. The avarice of Mahomet might have been satisfied with an annual sum of 100,000 ducats, but his ambition grasped to the capital of the East. To the prince he offered a rich equivalent, to the people a free toleration, or a safe departure; but after some fruitless treaty, he declared his resolution of finding either a throne or a grave under the walls of Constantinople. A sense of honor, and the fear of universal reproach, forbade Palaeologus to resign the city into the hands of the Ottomans, and he determined to abide the last extremities of war. Several days were employed by the sultan in the preparations of the assault, and a respite was granted by his favorite science of astrology, which had fixed on the 29th of May as the fortunate and fatal hour. On the evening of the 27th he issued his final orders, assembled in his presence the military chiefs, and dispersed his heralds through the camp to proclaim the duty and the motives of the perilous enterprise. Fear is the first principle of a despotic government, and his menaces were expressed in the Oriental style, that the fugitives and deserters, had they the wings of a bird, should not escape from his inexorable justice. The greater part of his bashaws and janissaries were the offspring of Christian parents, but the glories of the Turkish name were perpetuated by successive adoption, and in the gradual change of individuals, the spirit of a legion, a regiment, or of an Oda, is kept alive by imitation and discipline. In this holy warfare, the Moslems were exhorted to purify their minds with prayer, their bodies with 7 ablutions, and to abstain from food till the close of the ensuing day. A crowd of dervises visited the tents, to instill the desire of martyrdom, and the assurance of spending an immortal youth amidst the rivers and gardens of paradise, and in the embraces of the black-eyed virgins. Yet Mahomet principally trusted to the efficacy of temporal and visible rewards. A double pay was promised to the victorious troops. "The city and the buildings," said Mahomet, "are mine, but I resign to your valor the captives and the spoil, the treasures of gold and beauty. Be rich and be happy. Many are the provinces in my empire. The intrepid soldier who first ascends the walls of Constantinople shall be rewarded with the government of the fairest and most wealthy, and my gratitude shall accumulate his honors and fortunes above the measure of his own hopes." Such various and potent motives diffused among the Turks a general ardor, regardless of life, and impatient for action. The camp re-echoed with the Moslem shouts of "God is God! There is but one God, and Mohammed is the apostle of God!" And the sea and land, from Galata to the 7 Towers, were illuminated by the blaze of their nocturnal fires. Far different was the state of the Christians, who, with loud and impotent complaints, deplored the guilt or the punishment of their sins. The celestial image of the Virgin had been exposed in solemn procession, but their divine patroness was deaf to their entreaties. They accused the obstinacy of the emperor, for refusing a timely surrender, anticipated the horrors of their fate, and sighed for the repose and security of Turkish servitude. The noblest of the Greeks and the bravest of the allies were summoned to the palace, to prepare them, on the evening of the 28th, for the duties and dangers of the general assault. The last speech of Palaeologus was the funeral oration of the Roman empire. He promised, he conjured, he vainly attempted to infuse the hope which was extinguished in his own mind. In this world all was comfortless and gloomy, and neither the gospel nor the church have proposed any conspicuous recompense to the heroes who fall in the service of their country. But the example of their prince and the confinement of a siege had armed these warriors with the courage of despair, and the pathetic scene is described by the feelings of the historian Phranza, who was himself present at this mournful assembly. They wept, they embraced, regardless of their families and fortunes, they devoted their lives, and each commander, departing to his station, maintained all night a vigilant and anxious watch on the rampart. The emperor and some faithful companions entered the dome of St. Sophia, which in a few hours was to be converted into a mosque, and devoutly received, with tears and prayers, the sacrament of the Holy Communion. He reposed some moments in the palace, which resounded with cries and lamentation, solicited the pardon of all whom he might have injured, and mounted on horseback to visit the guards, to explore the motions of the enemy. The distress and fall of the last Constantine was more glorious than the long prosperity of the Byzantine Caesars. In the confusion of darkness, an assailant may sometimes succeed; but in this great and general attack, the military judgment and astrological knowledge of Mahomet advised him to expect the morning, the memorable 29th of May, in the 1453rd year of the Christian era. The preceding night had been strenuously employed. The troops, the cannon, and the fascines were advanced to the edge of the ditch, which in many parts presented a smooth and level passage to the breach, and his 80 galleys almost touched with the prows and their scaling ladders the less defensible walls of the harbor. Under pain of death, silence was enjoined; but the physical laws of motion and sound are not obedient to discipline or fear. Each individual might suppress his voice and measure his footsteps, but the march and labor of thousands must inevitably produce a strange confusion of dissonant clamors, which reached the ears of the watchmen of the towers. At daybreak, without the customary signal of the morning gun, the Turks assaulted the city by sea and land, and the similitude of a twined or twisted thread has been applied to the closeness and continuity of their line of attack. The foremost ranks consisted of the refuse of the host, a voluntary crowd who fought without order or command. Of the feebleness of age or childhood, of peasants and vagrants, and of all who had joined the camp in the blind hope of plunder and martyrdom, the common impulse drove them onwards to the wall. The most audacious to climb were instantly precipitated, and not a dart nor a bullet of the Christians was idly wasted on the accumulated throng. But their strength and ammunition were exhausted in this laborious defense. The ditch was filled with the bodies of the slain, and they supported the footsteps of their companions; and of this devoted vanguard, the death was more serviceable than the life. Under the respective bashaws and sanjaks, the troops of Anatolia and Romania were successively led to the charge. Their progress was various and doubtful; but, after a conflict of 2 hours, the Greeks still maintained and improved their advantage, and the voice of the emperor was heard encouraging his soldiers to achieve, by a last effort, the deliverance of their country. At that fatal moment, the Janizaries arose, fresh, vigorous, and invincible. The sultan himself on horseback, with an iron mace in his hand, was the spectator and judge of their valor. He was surrounded by 10,000 of his domestic troops, whom he reserved for the decisive occasion, and the tide of battle was directed and impelled by his voice and eye. His numerous ministers of justice were posted behind the line, to urge, to restrain, and to punish; and if danger was in the front, shame and inevitable death were in the rear of the fugitives. The cries of fear and of pain were drowned in the martial music of drums, trumpets, and atabals; and experience has proved that the mechanical operations of sounds, by quickening the circulation of the blood and spirits, will act on the human machine more forcibly than the eloquence of reason and honor. From the lines, the galleys, and the bridge, the Ottoman artillery thundered on all sides. In the camp, in city, the Greeks and the Turks were involved in a cloud of smoke, which could only be dispelled by the final deliverance or destruction of the Roman empire. The single combats of the heroes of history or fable amuse our fancy and engage our affections. The skilled evolutions of war may inform the mind, and improve a necessary though pernicious science. But in the uniform and odious pictures of a general assault, all is blood, and horror, and confusion. Nor shall I strive, at the distance of 3 centuries and 1,000 miles, to delineate a scene of which there could be no spectators, and of which the actors themselves were incapable of forming any just or adequate idea. The immediate loss of Constantinople may be ascribed to the bullet or arrow which pierced the gauntlet of John Justiniani. The sight of his blood, and the exquisite pain, appalled the courage of the chief, whose arms and counsels were the firmest rampart of the city. As he withdrew from his station in quest of a surgeon, his flight was perceived and stopped by the indefatigable emperor. "Your wound," exclaimed Palaeologus, "is slight; the danger is pressing; your presence is necessary; and whither will you retire?" "I will retire," said the trembling Genoese, "by the same road which God has opened to the Turks." And at these words he hastily passed through one of the breaches of the inner wall. By this pusillanimous act he stained the honors of a military life; and the few days which he survived in Galata, or the Isle of Chios, were embittered by his own and the public reproach. His example was imitated by the greatest part of the Latin auxiliaries; and the defense began to slacken, when the attack was pressed with redoubled vigor. The number of the Ottomans was 50, perhaps 100 times superior to that of the Christians. The double walls were reduced by the cannon to a heap of ruins. In a circuit of several miles, some places must be found more easy of access, or more feebly guarded; and if the besiegers could penetrate in a single point, the whole city was irrecoverably lost. The first who deserved the sultan's reward was Hassan the Janizary, of gigantic stature and strength. With his cimeter in one hand, and his buckler in the other, he ascended the outward fortifications. Of the 30 Janizaries who were emulous of his valor, 18 perished in the bold adventure. Hassan and his 12 companions had reached the summit. The giant was precipitated from the rampart. He rose on one knee, and was again oppressed by a shower of darts and stones. But his success had proved that the achievement was possible. The walls and towers were instantly covered with a swarm of Turks; and the Greeks, now driven from the vantage ground, were overwhelmed by the increasing multitudes. Amidst these multitudes, the emperor, who accomplished all the duties of a general and a soldier, was long seen, and finally lost. The nobles who fought round his person sustained, till their last breath, the honorable names of Palaeologus and Cantacuzene. His mournful exclamation was heard, "Cannot there be found a Christian to cut off my head?" And his last fear was that of falling alive into the hands of the infidels. The prudent despair of Constantine cast away the purple. Amidst the tumult he fell by an unknown hand, and his body was buried under a mountain of the slain. After his death, resistance and order were no more. The Greeks fled towards the city, and many were pressed and stifled in the narrow pass of the gate of St. Romanus. The victorious Turks rushed through the breaches of the inner wall, and as they advanced into the streets, they were soon joined by their brethren, who had forced the gate Phenar on the side of the harbor. In the first heat of the pursuit, about 2,000 Christians were put to the sword; but avarice soon prevailed over cruelty, and the victors acknowledged that they should immediately have given quarter, if the valor of the emperor and his chosen band had not prepared them for a similar opposition in every part of the capital. It was thus, after a siege of 53 days, that Constantinople, which had defied the power of Chosroes, of the Chagan, and the caliphs, was irretrievably subdued by the arms of Mahomet II. Her empire only had been subverted by the Latins. Her religion was trampled in the dust by the Moslem conquerors. Chapter 68, Part 3. Chapter 68, Part 4 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, Volume 6, Chapter 68, Part 4. The tidings of misfortune fly with a rapid wing. Yet such was the extent of Constantinople that the more distant quarters might prolong some moments the happy ignorance of their ruin. But in the general consternation, in the feelings of selfish or social anxiety, in the tumult and thunder of the assault, a sleepless night and morning must have elapsed. Nor can I believe that many Grecian ladies were awakened by the Janissaries from a sound and tranquil slumber. On the assurance of the public calamity, the houses and convents were instantly deserted, and the trembling inhabitants flocked together in the streets like a herd of timid animals, as if accumulated weakness could be productive of strength, or in the vain hope that amid the crowd each individual might be safe and invisible. From every part of the capital they flowed into the church of St. Sophia. In the space of an hour, the sanctuary, the choir, the nave, the upper and lower galleries, were filled with the multitudes of fathers and husbands, of women and children, of priests, monks, and religious virgins. The doors were barred on the inside, and they sought protection from the sacred dome which they had so lately abhorred as a profane and polluted edifice. Their confidence was founded on the prophecy of an enthusiast or impostor, that one day the Turks would enter Constantinople, and pursue the Romans as far as the column of Constantine, on the square before St. Sophia, but that this would be the term of their calamities, that an angel would descend from heaven with a sword in his hand, and would deliver the empire with that celestial weapon to a poor man seated at the foot of the column. "Take this sword," would he say, "and avenge the people of the Lord." At these animating words the Turks would instantly fly, and the victorious Romans would drive them from the west, and from all Anatolia as far as the frontiers of Persia. It was on this occasion that Ducas, with some fancy and much truth, upbraids the discord and obstinacy of the Greeks. "Had that angel appeared," exclaims the historian, "had he offered to exterminate your foes, if you would consent to the union of the church, even then, in that fatal moment, you would have rejected your safety, or have deceived your God." While they expected the descent of the tardy angel, the doors were broken with axes, and as soon as the Turks encountered no resistance, their bloodless hands were employed in selecting and securing the multitude of their prisoners. Youth, beauty, and the appearance of wealth attracted their choice, and the right of property was decided among themselves by a prior seizure, by personal strength, and by the authority of command. In this space of an hour the male captives were bound with cords, the females with their veils and girdles. The senators were linked with their slaves, the prelates with the porters of the church, and the young men of a plebeian class with the noble maids whose faces had been invisible to the sun and their nearest kindred. In this common captivity the ranks of society were confounded, the ties of nature were cut asunder, and the inexorable soldier was careless of the father's groans, the tears of the mother, the lamentations of the children. The loudest in their wailings were the nuns, who were torn from the altar with naked bosoms, outstretched hands, and dishevelled hair, and we should piously believe that few could be tempted to prefer the vigils of the harem to those of the monastery. Of these unfortunate Greeks, of these domestic animals, whole strings were rudely driven through the streets, and as the conquerors were eager to return for more prey, their trembling pace was quickened with menaces and blows. At the same hour a similar rapine was exercised in all the churches and monasteries, in all the palaces and habitations of the capital, nor could any place, however sacred or sequestered, protect the persons or the property of the Greeks. Above 60,000 of this devoted people were transported from the city to the camp and fleet, exchanged or sold according to the caprice or interest of their masters, and dispersed in remote servitude through the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Among these we may notice some remarkable characters. The historian Phranza, first chamberlain and principal secretary, was involved with his family in the common lot. After suffering 4 months the hardships of slavery, he recovered his freedom. In the ensuing winter, he ventured to Adrianople, and ransomed his wife from the Mir Bashi, or master of the horse; but his 2 children, in the flower of youth and beauty, had been seized for the use of Mahomet himself. The daughter of Phranza died in the seraglio, perhaps a virgin. His son, in the 15th year of his age, preferred death to infamy, and was stabbed by the hand of the royal lover. A deed thus inhuman cannot surely be expiated by the taste and liberality with which he released a Grecian matron and her 2 daughters, on receiving a Latin ode from Philaelphus, who had chosen a wife in that noble family. The pride or cruelty of Mahomet would have been most sensibly gratified by the capture of a Roman legate; but the dexterity of Cardinal Isidore eluded the search, and he escaped from Galata in a plebeian habit. The chain and entrance of the outward harbor was still occupied by the Italian ships of merchandise and war. They had signalized their valor in the siege. They embraced the moment of retreat, while the Turkish mariners were dissipated in the pillage of the city. When they hoisted sail, the beach was covered with a suppliant and lamentable crowd. But the means of transportation were scanty. The Venetians and Genoese selected their countrymen, and notwithstanding the fairest promises of the sultan, the inhabitants of Galata evacuated their houses, and embarked with their most precious effects. In the fall and sack of great cities, an historian is condemned to repeat the tale of uniform calamity. The same effects must be produced by the same passions, and when these passions may be indulged without control, small, alas, is the difference between civilized and savage man. Amidst the vague exclamations of bigotry and hatred, the Turks are not accused of a wanton or immoderate effusion of Christian blood; but according to their maxims, the maxims of antiquity, the lives of the vanquished were forfeited, and the legitimate reward of the conqueror was derived from the service, the sale, or the ransom, of his captives of both sexes. The wealth of Constantinople had been granted by the sultan to his victorious troops, and the rapine of an hour is more productive than the industry of years. But as no regular division was attempted of the spoil, the respective shares were not determined by merit, and the rewards of valor were stolen away by the followers of the camp, who had declined the toil and danger of the battle. The narrative of their depredations could not afford either amusement or instruction. The total amount, in the last poverty of the empire, has been valued at 4 millions of ducats; and of this sum a small part was the property of the Venetians, the Genoese, the Florentines, and the merchants of Ancona. Of these foreigners the stock was improved in quick and perpetual circulation. But the riches of the Greeks were displayed in the idle ostentation of palaces and wardrobes, or deeply buried in treasuries and ingots and old coin, lest it should be demanded at their hands for the defense of their country. The profanation and plunder of the monasteries and churches excited the most tragic complaints. The dome of St. Sophia itself, the earthly heaven, the second firmament, the vehicle of the cherubim, the throne of the glory of God, was despoiled of the oblations of ages, and the gold and silver, the pearls and jewels, the vases and sacerdotal ornaments, were most wickedly converted to the service of mankind. After the divine images had been stripped of all that could be valuable to a profane eye, the canvas or the wood was torn or broken, or burnt, or trod under foot, or applied in the stables or the kitchen to the vilest uses. The example of sacrilege was imitated, however, from the Latin conquerors of Constantinople, and the treatment which Christ, the Virgin, and the saints had sustained from the guilty Catholic might be inflicted by the zealous Mussulman on the monuments of idolatry. Perhaps, instead of enjoining the public clamor, a philosopher will observe that in the decline of the arts the workmanship cannot be more valuable than the work, and that a fresh supply of visions and miracles would speedily be renewed by the craft of the priest and the credulity of the people. He will more seriously deplore the loss of the Byzantine libraries, which were destroyed or scattered in the general confusion. 120,000 manuscripts are said to have disappeared. 10 volumes might be purchased for a single ducat, and the same ignominious price, too high perhaps for a shelf of theology, included the whole works of Aristotle and Homer, the noblest productions of the science and literature of ancient Greece. We may reflect with pleasure that an inestimable portion of our classic treasures were safely deposited in Italy, and that the mechanics of a German town had invented an art which derides the havoc of time and barbarism. From the first hour of the memorable 29th of May, disorder and rapine prevailed in Constantinople till the 8th hour of the same day, when the sultan himself passed in triumph through the gate of St. Romanus. He was attended by his viziers, bashaws, and guards, each of whom, says a Byzantine historian, was robust as Hercules, dexterous as Apollo, and equal in battle to any 10 of the race of ordinary mortals. The conqueror gazed with satisfaction and wonder on the strange though splendid appearance of the domes and palaces, so dissimilar from the style of Oriental architecture. In the hippodrome, or Antemedon, his eye was attracted by the twisted column of 3 serpents, and as a trial of strength he shattered with his iron mace or battle axe the underjaw of one of these monsters, which in the eyes of the Turks were the idols or talismans of the city. At the principal dome of St. Sophia he alighted from his horse and entered the dome, and such was his jealous regard for that monument of his glory, that, on observing a zealous Mussulman in the act of breaking the marble pavement, he admonished him with his scimitar that, if the spoil and captives were granted to the soldiers, the public and private buildings had been reserved for the prince. By his command, the metropolis of the Eastern Church was transformed into a mosque. The rich and portable instruments of superstition had been removed, the crosses were thrown down, and the walls, which were covered with images and mosaics, were washed and purified, and restored to a state of naked simplicity. On the same day, or on the ensuing Friday, the muezzin, or crier, ascended to the most lofty turret, and proclaimed the ezzan, or public invitation, in the name of God and his prophet. The imam preached, and Mohammed II performed the namaz of prayer and thanksgiving on the great altar, where the Christian mysteries had so lately been celebrated, before the last of the Caesars. From St. Sophia he proceeded to the august but desolate mansion of 100 successors of the great Constantine, but which in a few hours had been stripped of the pomp of royalty. A melancholy reflection on the vicissitudes of human greatness forced itself on his mind, and he repeated an elegant distich of Persian poetry. The spider has wove his web in the Imperial palace, and the owl hath sung her watch song on the towers of Afrasiab. Yet his mind was not satisfied, nor did the victory seem complete, till he was informed of the fate of Constantine, whether he had escaped, or been made prisoner, or had fallen in the battle. 2 Janizaries claimed the honor and reward of his death. The body, under a heap of slain, was discovered by the golden eagles embroidered on his shoes. The Greeks acknowledged with tears the head of their late emperor, and, after exposing the bloody trophy, Mohammed bestowed on his rival the honors of a decent funeral. After his decease, Lucas Notaras, great duke and first minister of the empire, was the most important prisoner. When he offered his person and his treasures at the feet of the throne, "And why," said the indignant sultan, "did you not employ these treasures in the defense of your prince and country?" "They were yours," answered the slave. "God had reserved them for your hands." "If he reserved them for me," replied the despot, "how have you presumed to withhold them so long by a fruitless and fatal resistance?" The great duke alleged the obstinacy of the strangers, and some secret encouragement from the Turkish vizier; and from this perilous interview he was at length dismissed with the assurance of pardon and protection. Mohammed condescended to visit his wife, a venerable princess, oppressed with sickness and grief, and his consolation for her misfortunes was in the most tender strain of humanity and filial reverence. A similar clemency was extended to the principal officers of state, of whom several were ransomed at his expense, and during some days he declared himself the friend and father of the vanquished people. But the scene was soon changed, and before his departure the hippodrome streamed with the blood of his noblest captives. His perfidious cruelty is execrated by the Christians. They adorn with the colors of heroic martyrdom the execution of the great duke and his 2 sons, and his death is ascribed to the generous refusal of delivering his children to the tyrant's lust. Yet a Byzantine historian has dropped an unguarded word of conspiracy, deliverance, and Italian succor. Such treason may be glorious, but the rebel who bravely ventures has justly forfeited his life. Nor should we blame a conqueror for destroying the enemies whom he could no longer trust. On the 18th of June, the victorious sultan returned to Adrianople, and smiled at the base and hollow embassies of the Christian princes, who viewed their approaching ruin and the fall of the Eastern empire. Constantinople had been left naked and desolate, without a prince or a people; but she could not be despoiled of the incomparable situation which marks her for the metropolis of a great empire, and the genius of the place will ever triumph over the accidents of time and fortune. Boursa and Adrianople, the ancient seats of the Ottomans, sunk into provincial towns, and Mahomet II established his own residence and that of his successors on the same commanding spot which had been chosen by Constantine. The fortifications of Galata, which might afford a shelter to the Latins, were prudently destroyed; but the damage of the Turkish cannon was soon repaired, and before the month of August great quantities of lime had been burnt for the restoration of the walls of the capital. As the entire property of the soil and the buildings, whether public or private, or profane or sacred, was now transferred to the conqueror, he first separated a space of 8 furlongs from the point of the triangle for the establishment of his seraglio, or palace. It is here, in the bosom of luxury, that the Grand Signor, as he has been emphatically named by the Italians, appears to reign over Europe and Asia. But his persons on the shore of the Bosphorus may not always be secure from the insults of a hostile navy. In the new character of a mosque, the cathedral of St. Sophia was endowed with an ample revenue, crowned with lofty minarets, and surrounded with groves and fountains for the devotion and refreshment of the Moslems. The same model was imitated by the Jani, or royal mosques, and the first of these was built by Mahomet himself, on the ruins of the church of the Holy Apostles and the tombs of the Greek emperors. On the 3rd day after the conquest, the grave of Abu Ayyub, or Job, who had fallen in the first siege of the Arabs, was revealed in a vision; and it is before the sepulchre of the martyr that the new sultans are girded with the sword of empire. Constantinople no longer appertains to the Roman historian; nor shall I enumerate the civil and religious edifices which were profaned or erected by its Turkish masters. The population was speedily renewed, and before the end of September 5,000 families of Anatolia and Romania had obeyed the royal mandate which enjoined them, under pain of death, to occupy their new habitations in the capital. The throne of Mahomet was guarded by the numbers and fidelity of his Moslem subjects; but his rational policy aspired to collect the remnant of the Greeks, and they returned in crowds as soon as they were assured of their lives, their liberties, and a free exercise of their religion. In the election and investiture of a patriarch, the ceremonial of the Byzantine court was revived and imitated. With a mixture of satisfaction and horror they beheld the sultan on his throne, who delivered into the hands of Gennadius the crosier, or pastoral staff, the symbol of his ecclesiastical office; who conducted the patriarch to the gate of the seraglio, presented him with a horse richly caparisoned, and directed the viziers and bashaws to lead him to the palace which had been allotted for his residence. The churches of Constantinople were shared between the two religions; their limits were marked; and, till it was infringed by Selim, the grandson of Mahomet, the Greeks enjoyed above 60 years the benefit of this equal partition. Encouraged by the ministers of the Divan, who wished to elude the fanaticism of the sultan, the Christian advocates presumed to allege that this division had been an act, not of generosity, but of justice; not a concession, but a compact; and that, if one half of the city had been taken by storm, the other moiety had surrendered on the faith of a sacred capitulation. The original grant had indeed been consumed by fire; but the loss was supplied by the testimony of 3 aged Janizaries, who remembered the transaction, and their venal oaths are of more weight in the opinion of Cantemir than the positive and unanimous consent of the history of the times. The remaining fragments of the Greek kingdom in Europe and Asia I shall abandon to the Turkish arms. But the final extinction of the last two dynasties which have reigned in Constantinople should terminate the decline and fall of the Roman empire in the East. The despots of the Morea, Demetrius and Thomas, the last two brothers of the name of Palaeologus, were astonished by the death of the emperor Constantine and the ruin of the monarchy. Hopeless of defence, they prepared, with the noble Greeks who adhered to their fortune, to seek a refuge in Italy, beyond the reach of the Ottoman thunder. Their first apprehensions were dispelled by the victorious sultan, who contented himself with a tribute of 12,000 ducats; and while his ambition explored the continent and islands in search of prey, he indulged the Morea in a respite of 7 years. But this respite was a period of grief, discord, and misery. The Hexamilion, or rampart of the Isthmus, so often raised and so often subverted, could not long be defended by 300 Italian archers. The keys of Corinth were seized by the Turks. They returned from their summer excursions with a train of captives and spoil, and the complaints of the injured Greeks were heard with indifference and disdain. The Albanians, a vagrant tribe of shepherds and robbers, filled the peninsula with rapine and murder. The two despots implored the dangerous and humiliating aid of a neighboring bashaw; and when he had quelled the revolt, his lessons inculcated the rule of their future conduct. Neither the ties of blood, nor the oaths which they repeatedly pledged in the communion and before the altar, nor the stronger pressure of necessity, could reconcile or suspend their domestic quarrels. They ravaged each other's patrimony with fire and sword. The alms and succors of the West were consumed in civil hostility, and their power was only exerted in savage and arbitrary executions. The success and revenge of the weaker rival invoked their supreme lord; and, in the season of maturity and revenge, Mahomet declared himself the friend of Demetrius, and marched into the Morea with an irresistible force. When he had taken possession of Sparta, "You are too weak," said the sultan, "to control this turbulent province. I will take your daughter to my bed, and you will pass the remainder of your life in security and honor." Demetrius sighed and obeyed, surrendered his daughter and his castles, followed to Adrianople his sovereign and son, and received for his own maintenance and those of his followers a city in Thrace, and the adjacent isles of Imbros, Lemnos, and Samothrace. He was joined the next year by a companion of misfortune, the last of the Comnenian race, who, after the taking of Constantinople by the Latins, had founded a new empire on the coast of the Black Sea. In the progress of his Anatolian conquests, Mahomet invested with a fleet and army the capital of David, who presumed to style himself Emperor of Trebizond, and the negotiation was comprised in a short and peremptory question: "Will you secure your life and treasures by resigning your kingdom? Or had you rather forfeit your kingdom, your treasures, and your life?" The feeble Comnenus was subdued by his own fears, and the example of a Mussulman neighbor, the prince of Sinope, who, on a similar summons, had yielded a fortified city with 400 cannon and 10 or 12,000 soldiers. The capitulation of Trebizond was faithfully performed, and the emperor with his family was transported to a castle in Romania. But on a slight suspicion of corresponding with the Persian king, David and the whole Comnenian race were sacrificed to the jealousy or avarice of the conqueror. Nor could the name of father long protect the unfortunate Demetrius from exile and confiscation. His abject submission moved the pity and contempt of the sultan. His followers were transplanted to Constantinople, and his poverty was alleviated by a pension of 50,000 aspers, till a monastic habit, and a tardy death, released Palaeologus from an earthly master. It is not easy to pronounce whether the servitude of Demetrius, or the exile of his brother Thomas, be the most inglorious. On the conquest of the Morea, the despot escaped to Corfu, and from thence to Italy, with some naked adherents. His name, his sufferings, and the head of the apostle St. Andrew, entitled him to the hospitality of the Vatican, and his misery was prolonged by a pension of 6,000 ducats from the pope and cardinals. His two sons, Andrew and Manuel, were educated in Italy; but the eldest, contemptible to his enemies, and burdensome to his friends, was degraded by the baseness of his life and marriage. A title was his sole inheritance, and that inheritance he successively sold to the kings of France and Aragon. During his transient prosperity, Charles VIII. Was ambitious of joining the empire of the East with the kingdom of Naples. In a public festival, he assumed the appellation in purple of Augustus. The Greeks rejoiced, and the Ottoman already trembled at the approach of the French chivalry. Manuel Palaeologus, the second son, was tempted to revisit his native country. His return might be grateful, and could not be dangerous to the Porte. He was maintained at Constantinople in safety and ease, and an honorable train of Christians and Moslems attended him to the grave. If there be some animals of so generous a nature that they refuse to propagate in a domestic state, the last of the imperial race must be ascribed to an inferior kind. He accepted from the sultan's liberality 2 beautiful females, and his surviving son was lost in the habit and religion of a Turkish slave. The importance of Constantinople was felt and magnified in its loss. The pontificate of Nicholas V., however peaceful and prosperous, was dishonored by the fall of the Eastern Empire, and the grief and terror of the Latins revived, or seemed to revive, the old enthusiasm of the Crusades. In one of the most distant countries of the West, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, entertained at Lille, in Flanders, an assembly of his nobles, and the pompous pageants of the feast were skilfully adapted to their fancy and feelings. In the midst of the banquet, a giant Saracen entered the hall, leading a fictitious elephant with a castle on his back. A matron in a mourning robe, the symbol of religion, was seen to issue from the castle. She deplored her oppression, and accused the slowness of her champions. The principal herald of the Golden Fleece advanced, bearing on his fist a live pheasant, which, according to the rites of chivalry, he presented to the duke. At this extraordinary summons, Philip, a wise and aged prince, engaged his person and powers in the holy war against the Turks. His example was imitated by the barons and knights of the assembly. They swore to God, the Virgin, the ladies, and the pheasant, and their particular vows were not less extravagant than the general sanction of their oath. But the performance was made to depend on some future and foreign contingency, and during 12 years, till the last hour of his life, the Duke of Burgundy might be scrupulously, and perhaps sincerely, on the eve of his departure. Had every breast glowed with the same ardor, had the union of the Christians corresponded with their bravery, had every country from Sweden to Naples supplied a just proportion of cavalry and infantry, of men and money, it is indeed probable that Constantinople would have been delivered, and that the Turks might have been chased beyond the Hellespont or the Euphrates. But the secretary of the emperor, who composed every epistle and attended every meeting, Aeneas Sylvius, a statesman and orator, describes from his own experience the repugnant state and spirit of Christendom. "It is a body," says he, "without a head, a republic without laws or magistrates. The pope and the emperor may shine as lofty titles, as splendid images, but they are unable to command, and none are willing to obey. Every state has a separate prince, and every prince has a separate interest. What eloquence could unite so many discordant and hostile powers under the same standard? Could they be assembled in arms, who would dare to assume the office of general? What order could be maintained? What military discipline? Who would undertake to feed such an enormous multitude? Who would understand their various languages, or direct their stranger and incompatible manners? What mortal could reconcile the English with the French, Genoa with Aragon, the Germans with the natives of Hungary and Bohemia? If a small number enlisted in the holy war, they must be overthrown by the infidels; if many, by their own weight and confusion." Yet the same Aeneas, when he was raised to the papal throne under the name of Pius II., devoted his life to the prosecution of the Turkish war. In the council of Mantua he excited some sparks of a false or feeble enthusiasm. But when the pontiff appeared at Ancona to embark in person with the troops, engagements vanished in excuses. A precise day was adjourned to an indefinite term, and his effective army consisted of some German pilgrims, whom he was obliged to disband with indulgences and alms. Regardless of futurity, his successors and the powers of Italy were involved in the schemes of present and domestic ambition; and the distance or proximity of each object determined in their eyes its apparent magnitude. A more enlarged view of their interest would have taught them to maintain a defensive and naval war against the common enemy; and the support of Scanderbeg and his brave Albanians might have prevented the subsequent invasion of the kingdom of Naples. The siege and sack of Otranto by the Turks diffused a general consternation; and Pope Sixtus was preparing to fly beyond the Alps, when the storm was instantly dispelled by the death of Mahomet II. in the 51st year of his age. His lofty genius aspired to the conquest of Italy; he was possessed of a strong city and a capacious harbor; and the same reign might have been decorated with the trophies of the new and the ancient Rome. End of chapter 68, part 4.
Chapter 69, Part 1 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 69, State of Rome from the 12th Century, Part 1. State of Rome from the 12th Century. Temporal dominion of the popes. Seditions of the city. Political heresy of Arnold of Brescia. Restoration of the Republic. The senators. Pride of the Romans. Their wars. They are deprived of the election and presence of the popes who retire to Avignon. The Jubilee. Noble families of Rome. Void of the Colonna and Ursini. In the first ages of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, our eye is invariably fixed on the royal city, which had given laws to the fairest portion of the globe. We contemplate her fortunes, at first with admiration, at length with pity, always with attention, and when that attention is diverted from the capital to the provinces, they are considered as so many branches which have been successively severed from the imperial trunk. The foundation of a second Rome, on the shores of the Bosphorus, has compelled the historian to follow the successors of Constantine, and our curiosity has been tempted to visit the most remote countries of Europe and Asia, to explore the causes and the authors of the long decay of the Byzantine monarchy. By the conquest of Justinian, we have been recalled to the banks of the Tiber, to the deliverance of the ancient metropolis, but that deliverance was a change, or perhaps an aggravation, of servitude. Rome had been already stripped of her trophies, her gods, and her Caesars; nor was the Gothic dominion more inglorious and oppressive than the tyranny of the Greeks. In this 8th century of the Christian era, a religious quarrel, the worship of images, provoked the Romans to assert their independence. Their bishop became the temporal as well as the spiritual father of a free people, and of the Western Empire, which was restored by Charlemagne. The title and image still decorate the singular constitution of modern Germany. The name of Rome must yet command our involuntary respect. The climate, whatsoever may be its influence, was no longer the same. The purity of blood had been contaminated through 1,000 channels, but the venerable aspect of her ruins and the memory of past greatness rekindled a spark of the national character. The darkness of the Middle Ages exhibits some scenes not unworthy of our notice. Nor shall I dismiss the present work till I have reviewed the state and revolutions of the Roman city, which acquiesced under the absolute dominion of the popes, about the same time that Constantinople was enslaved by the Turkish arms. In the beginning of the 12th century, the era of the first crusade, Rome was revered by the Latins as the metropolis of the world, as the throne of the pope and the emperor, who, from the eternal city, derived their title, their honors, and the right or exercise of temporal dominion. After so long an interruption, it may not be useless to repeat that the successors of Charlemagne and the Othos were chosen beyond the Rhine in a national diet, but that these princes were content with the humble names of kings of Germany and Italy, till they had passed the Alps and the Apennine, to seek their imperial crown on the banks of the Tiber. At some distance from the city, their approach was saluted by a long procession of the clergy and people with palms and crosses, and the terrific emblems of wolves and lions, of dragons and eagles, that floated in the military banners, represented the departed legions and cohorts of the republic. The royal path to maintain the liberties of Rome was thrice reiterated, at the bridge, the gate, and on the stairs of the Vatican, and the distribution of a customary donative feebly imitated the magnificence of the first Caesars. In the church of St. Peter the coronation was performed by his successor, the voice of God was confounded with that of the people, and the public consent was declared in the acclamations of "Long life and victory to our Lord the Pope! Long life and victory to our Lord the Emperor! Long life and victory to the Roman and Teutonic armies!" The names of Caesar and Augustus, the laws of Constantine and Justinian, the example of Charlemagne and Otho, established the supreme dominion of the emperors; their title and image was engraved on the papal coins, and their jurisdiction was marked by the sword of justice which they delivered to the prefect of the city. But every Roman prejudice was awakened by the name, the language, and the manners of a barbarian lord. The Caesars of Saxony or Franconia were the chiefs of a feudal aristocracy, nor could they exercise the discipline of civil and military power, which alone secures the obedience of a distant people, impatient of servitude, though perhaps incapable of freedom. Once, and once only, in his life, each emperor with an army of Teutonic vassals descended from the Alps. I have described the peaceful order of his entry and coronation, but that order was commonly disturbed by the clamor and sedition of the Romans, who encountered their sovereign as a foreign invader. His departure was always speedy, and often shameful, and in the absence of a long reign, his authority was insulted and his name was forgotten. The progress of independence in Germany and Italy undermined the foundations of the imperial sovereignty, and the triumph of the popes was the deliverance of Rome. Of her two sovereigns, the emperor had precariously reigned by the right of conquest, but the authority of the pope was founded on the soft, though more solid basis of opinion and habit. The removal of a foreign influence restored and endeared the shepherd to his flock; instead of the arbitrary or venal nomination of a German court, the vicar of Christ was freely chosen by the college of cardinals, most of whom were either natives or inhabitants of the city. The applause of the magistrates and people confirmed his election, and the ecclesiastical power that was obeyed in Sweden and Britain had been ultimately derived from the suffrage of the Romans. The same suffrage gave a prince as well as a pontiff to the capital. It was universally believed that Constantine had invested the popes with the temporal dominion of Rome, and the boldest civilians, the most profane skeptics, were satisfied with disputing the right of the emperor and the validity of his gift. The truth of the fact, the authenticity of his donation, was deeply rooted in the ignorance and tradition of 4 centuries, and the fabulous origin was lost in the real and permanent effects. The name of Dominus or Lord was inscribed on the coin of the bishops; their title was acknowledged by acclamations and oaths of allegiance, and with the free or reluctant consent of the German Caesars, they had long exercised a supreme or subordinate jurisdiction over the city and patrimony of St. Peter. The reign of the popes, which gratified their prejudices, was not incompatible with the liberties of Rome, and a more critical inquiry would have revealed a still nobler source of their power, the gratitude of a nation, whom they had rescued from the heresy and oppression of the Greek tyrant. In an age of superstition, it should seem that the union of the royal and sacerdotal characters would mutually fortify each other, would be the surest pledge of earthly obedience. The sanctity of the office might indeed be degraded by the personal vices of the man, but the scandals of the tenth century were obliterated by the austere and more dangerous virtues of Gregory VII. And his successors, and in the ambitious contests which they maintained for the rights of the Church, their sufferings or their success must equally tend to increase the popular veneration. They sometimes wandered in poverty and exile, the victims of persecution, and the apostolic zeal with which they offered themselves to martyrdom must engage the favor and sympathy of every Catholic breast. And sometimes, sundering from the Vatican, they created, judged, and deposed the kings of the world; nor could the proudest Roman be disgraced by submitting to a priest whose feet were kissed, and whose stirrup was held, by the successors of Charlemagne. Even the temporal interest of the city should have protected in peace and honor the residence of the popes, from whence a vain and lazy people derived the greatest part of their subsistence and riches. The fixed revenue of the popes was probably impaired; many of the old patrimonial estates, both in Italy and the provinces, had been invaded by sacrilegious hands; nor could the loss be compensated by the claim, rather than the possession, of the more ample gifts of Pepin and his descendants. But the Vatican and Capitol were nourished by the incessant and increasing swarms of pilgrims and suppliants; the pale of Christianity was enlarged, and the pope and cardinals were overwhelmed by the judgment of ecclesiastical and secular causes. A new jurisprudence had established in the Latin Church the right and practice of appeals; and from the north and west the bishops and abbots were invited or summoned to solicit, to complain, to accuse, or to justify, before the threshold of the apostles. A rare prodigy is once recorded, that two horses belonging to the archbishops of Mentz and Cologne repassed the Alps, yet laden with gold and silver; but it was soon understood that the success, both of the pilgrims and clients, depended much less on the justice of their cause than on the value of their offering. The wealth and piety of these strangers were ostentatiously displayed, and their expenses, sacred or profane, circulated in various channels from the emolument of the Romans. Such powerful motives should have firmly attached the voluntary and pious obedience of the Roman people to their spiritual and temporal father. But the operation of prejudice and interest is often disturbed by the sallies of ungovernable passion. The Indian who fells the tree that he may gather the fruit, and the Arab who plunders the caravans of commerce, are actuated by the same impulse of savage nature, which overlooks the future in the present, and relinquishes for momentary rapine the long and secure possession of the most important blessings. And it was thus that the shrine of St. Peter was profaned by the thoughtless Romans, who pillaged the offerings and wounded the pilgrims, without computing the number and value of similar visits, which they prevented by their inhospitable sacrilege. Even the influence of superstition is fluctuating and precarious, and the slave whose reason is subdued will often be delivered by his avarice or pride. A credulous devotion for the fables and oracles of the priesthood most powerful acts on the mind of a barbarian; yet such a mind is the least capable of preferring imagination to sense, or sacrificing to a distant motive, to an invisible, perhaps an ideal, object, the appetites and interests of the present world. In the vigor of health and youth his practice will perpetually contradict his belief, till the pressure of age, or sickness, or calamity awakens his terrors, and compels him to satisfy the double debt of piety and remorse. I have already observed that the modern times of religious indifference are the most favorable to the peace and security of the clergy. Under the reign of superstition they had much to hope from the ignorance, and much to fear from the violence of mankind. The wealth, whose constant increase must have rendered them the sole proprietors of the earth, was alternately bestowed by the repentant father and plundered by the rapacious son. Their persons were adored or violated, and the same idol, by the hands of the same votaries, was placed on the altar, or trampled in the dust. In the feudal system of Europe, arms were the title of distinction and the measure of allegiance, and amidst their tumult the still voice of law and reason was seldom heard or obeyed. The turbulent Romans disdained the yoke and insulted the impotence of their bishop, nor would his education or character allow him to exercise, with decency or effect, the power of the sword. The motives of his election and the frailties of his life were exposed to their familiar observation, and proximity must diminish the reverence which his name and his decrees impressed on a barbarous world. This difference was not escaped the notice of our philosophic historian. Though the name and authority of the court of Rome were so terrible in the remote countries of Europe, which were sunk in profound ignorance, and were entirely unacquainted with its character and conduct, the pope was so little revered at home, that his inveterate enemies surrounded the gates of Rome itself, and even controlled his government in that city; and the ambassadors who, from a distant extremity of Europe, carried to him the humble or rather abject submissions of the greatest potentate of the age, found the utmost difficulty to make their way to him and to throw themselves at his feet. Since the primitive times the wealth of the popes was exposed to envy, their powers to opposition, and their persons to violence; but the long hostility of the mitre and the crown increased the numbers, and inflamed the passions of their enemies. The deadly factions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines, so fatal to Italy, could never be embraced with truth or constancy by the Romans, the subjects and adversaries both of the bishop and emperor; but their support was solicited by both parties, and they alternately displayed in their banners the keys of St. Peter and the German eagle. Gregory VII., who may be adored or detested as the founder of the papal monarchy, was driven from Rome, and died in exile at Salerno. 36 of his successors, till their retreat to Avignon, maintained an unequal contest with the Romans; their age and dignity were often violated, and the churches, in the solemn rites of religion, were polluted with sedition and murder. A repetition of such capricious brutality, without connection or design, would be tedious and disgusting, and I shall content myself with some events of the 12th century, which represent the state of the popes and the city. On Holy Thursday, while Pascal officiated before the altar, he was interrupted by the clamors of the multitude, who imperiously demanded the confirmation of a favorite magistrate. His silence exasperated their fury; his pious refusal to mingle the affairs of earth and heaven was encountered with menaces and oaths, and he should be the cause and the witness of the public ruin. During the festival of Easter, while the bishop and the clergy, barefooted and in procession, visited the tombs of the martyrs, they were twice assaulted, at the bridge of St. Angelo and before the Capitol, with volleys of stones and darts. The houses of his adherents were levelled with the ground. Pascal escaped with difficulty and danger; he levied an army in the patrimony of St. Peter, and his last days were embittered by suffering and inflicting the calamities of civil war. The scenes that followed the election of his successor Gelasius II. Were still more scandalous to the church and city. Cencio Frangipani, a potent and factious baron, burst into the assembly furious and in arms. The cardinals were stripped, beaten, and trampled under foot, and he seized, without pity or respect, the vicar of Christ by the throat. Gelasius was dragged by the hair along the ground, buffeted with blows, mounted with spurs, and bound with an iron chain in the house of his brutal tyrant. An insurrection of the people delivered their bishop; the rival families opposed the violence of the Frangipani; and Cencio, who sued for pardon, repented of the failure, rather than of the guilt, of his enterprise. Not many days had elapsed, when the pope was again assaulted at the altar. While his friends and enemies were engaged in a bloody contest, he escaped in his sacerdotal garments. In this unworthy flight, which excited the compassion of the Roman matrons, his attendants were scattered or unhorsed; and in the fields behind the church of St. Peter, his successor was found alone, and half dead with fear and fatigue. Shaking the dust from his feet, the apostle withdrew from a city in which his dignity was insulted and his person was endangered; and the vanity of sacerdotal ambition is revealed in the involuntary confession, that one emperor was more tolerable than 20. These examples might suffice, but I cannot forget the sufferings of two pontiffs of the same age, the second and third of the name of Lucius. The former, as he ascended in battle array to assault the Capitol, was struck on the temple by a stone, and expired in a few days. The latter was severely wounded in the person of his servants. In a civil commotion several of his priests had been made prisoners, and the inhuman Romans, reserving one as a guide for his brethren, put out their eyes, crowned them with ludicrous mitres, mounted them on asses with their faces towards the tail, and extorted an oath, that, in this wretched condition, they should offer themselves as a lesson to the head of the church. Hope or fear, lassitude or remorse, the characters of the men and the circumstances of the times, might sometimes obtain an interval of peace and obedience, and the pope was restored with joyful acclamations to the Lateran or Vatican, from whence he had been driven with threats and violence. But the root of mischief was deep and perennial, and the momentary calm was preceded and followed by such tempests as had almost sunk the bark of St. Peter. Rome continually presented the aspect of war and discord; the churches and palaces were fortified and assaulted by the factions and families; and, after giving peace to Europe, Callistus II. Alone had resolution and power to prohibit the use of private arms in the metropolis. Among the nations who revered the apostolic throne, the tumults of Rome provoked a general indignation; and in a letter to his disciple Eugenius III., St. Bernard, with the sharpness of his wit and zeal, has stigmatized the vices of the rebellious people. Who is ignorant, says the monk of Clairvaux, of the vanity and arrogance of the Romans? A nation nursed in sedition, untractable, and scorning to obey, unless they are too feeble to resist. When they promise to serve, they aspire to reign; if they swear allegiance, they watch the opportunity of revolt; yet they vent their discontent in loud clamors, if your doors or your counsels are shut against them. Dexterous in mischief, they have never learned the science of doing good; odious to earth and heaven, impious to God, seditious among themselves, jealous of their neighbors, inhuman to strangers, they love no one, by no one are they beloved; and while they wish to inspire fear, they live in base and continual apprehension. They will not submit; they know not how to govern faithless to their superiors, intolerable to their equals, ungrateful to their benefactors, and alike impudent in their demands and their refusals. Lofty in promise, poor in execution, adulation and calumny, perfidy and treason, are the familiar arts of their policy. Surely this dark portrait is not colored by the pencil of Christian charity; yet the features, however harsh or ugly, express a lively resemblance of the Roman of the 12th century. The Jews had rejected the Christ when he appeared among them in a plebeian character, and the Romans might plead their ignorance of his vicar when he assumed the pomp and pride of a temporal sovereign. In the busy age of the Crusades, some sparks of curiosity and reason were rekindled in the Western world; the heresy of Bulgaria, the Paulician sect, was successfully transplanted into the soil of Italy and France; the Gnostic visions were mingled with the simplicity of the gospel; and the enemies of the clergy reconciled their passions with their conscience, the desire of freedom with the profession of piety. The trumpet of Roman liberty was first sounded by Arnold of Brescia, whose promotion in the church was confined to the lowest rank, and who wore the monastic habit rather as a garb of poverty than as a uniform of obedience. His adversaries could not deny the wit and eloquence which they severely felt. They confessed with reluctance the specious purity of his morals, and his errors were recommended to the public by a mixture of important and beneficial truths. In his theological studies he had been the disciple of the famous and unfortunate Abelard, who was likewise involved in the suspicion of heresy; but the lover of Eloisa was of a soft and flexible nature, and his ecclesiastical judges were edified and disarmed by the humility of his repentance. Arnold most probably imbibed some metaphysical definitions of the Trinity, repugnant to the taste of the times. His ideas of baptism and the Eucharist are loosely censured, but a political heresy was the source of his fame and misfortunes. He presumed to quote the declarations of Christ, that his kingdom is not of this world. He boldly maintained that the sword and the sceptre were entrusted to the civil magistrate, that temporal honours and possessions were lawfully vested in secular persons, that the abbots, the bishops, and the pope himself must renounce either their state or their salvation, and that after the loss of their revenues, the voluntary tithes and oblations of the faithful would suffice, not indeed for luxury and avarice, but for a frugal life in the exercise of spiritual labours. During a short time the preacher was revered as a patriot, and the discontent or revolt of Brescia against her bishop was the first fruits of his dangerous lessons. But the favour of the people is less permanent than the resentment of the priest, and after the heresy of Arnold had been condemned by Innocent II in the General Council of the Lateran, the magistrates themselves were urged by prejudice and fear to execute the sentence of the Church. Italy could no longer afford a refuge, and the disciple of Abelard escaped beyond the Alps, till he found a safe and hospitable shelter in Zurich, now the first of the Swiss cantons. From a Roman station, a royal villa, a chapter of noble virgins, Zurich had gradually increased to a free and flourishing city, where the appeals of the Milanese were sometimes tried by the imperial commissaries. In an age less ripe for reformation, the precursor of Zwinglius was heard with applause. A brave and simple people imbibed and long retained the colour of his opinions, and his art or merit seduced the Bishop of Constance, and even the Pope's legate, who forgot, for his sake, the interest of their master and their order. Their tardy zeal was quickened by the fierce exhortations of Saint Bernard, and the enemy of the Church was driven by persecution to the desperate measures of erecting his standard in Rome itself, in the face of the successor of Saint Peter. End of chapter 69, part 1. Chapter 69, part 2, of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 69, Part 2. Yet the courage of Arnold was not devoid of discretion. He was protected, and had perhaps been invited, by the nobles and people, and in the service of freedom his eloquence thundered o'er the seven hills. Blending in the same discourse the texts of Livy and St. Paul, uniting the motives of gospel and of classic enthusiasm, he admonished the Romans, how strangely their patience and the vices of the clergy had degenerated from the primitive times of the Church and the city. He exhorted them to assert the inalienable rights of men and Christians, to restore the laws and magistrates of the republic, to respect the name of the emperor, but to confine their shepherd to the spiritual government of his flock. Nor could his spiritual government escape the censure and control of the reformer, and the inferior clergy were taught by his lessons to resist the cardinals, who had usurped a despotic command over the 28 regions or parishes of Rome. The revolution was not accomplished without rapine and violence, the diffusion of blood and the demolition of houses. The victorious faction was enriched with the spoils of the clergy and the adverse nobles. Arnold of Brescia enjoyed or deplored the effects of his mission. His reign continued above 10 years, while two popes, Innocent II. And Anastasius IV., either trembled in the Vatican or wandered as exiles in the adjacent cities. They were succeeded by a more vigorous and fortunate pontiff, Adrian IV., the only Englishman who has ascended the throne of St. Peter, and whose merit emerged from the mean condition of a monk and almost a beggar in the monastery of St. Albans. On the first provocation of a cardinal killed or wounded in the streets, he cast an interdict on the guilty people, and from Christmas to Easter Rome was deprived of the real or imaginary comforts of religious worship. The Romans had despised their temporal prince. They submitted with grief and terror to the censures of their spiritual father. Their guilt was expiated by penance, and the banishment of the seditious preacher was the price of their absolution. But the revenge of Adrian was yet unsatisfied, and the approaching coronation of Frederick Barbarossa was fatal to the bold reformer who had offended, though not in an equal degree, the heads of the church and state. In their interview at Viterbo, the pope represented to the emperor the furious, ungovernable spirit of the Romans, the insults, the injuries, the fears to which his person and his clergy were continually exposed, and the pernicious tendency of the heresy of Arnold, which must subvert the principles of civil as well as ecclesiastical subordination. Frederick was convinced by these arguments, or tempted by the desire of the imperial crown. In the balance of ambition, the innocence or life of an individual is of small account, and their common enemy was sacrificed to a moment of political concord. After his retreat from Rome, Arnold had been protected by the Viscounts of Campania, from whom he was extorted by the power of Caesar. The prefect of the city pronounced his sentence. The martyr of freedom was burned alive in the presence of a careless and ungrateful people, and his ashes were cast into the Tiber, lest the heretics should collect and worship the relics of their master. The clergy triumphed in his death. With his ashes his sect was dispersed. His memory still lived in the minds of the Romans. From his school they had probably derived a new article of faith, that the metropolis of the Catholic Church is exempt from the penalties of excommunication and interdict. Their bishops might argue that the supreme jurisdiction which they exercised over kings and nations more especially embraced the city and diocese of the Prince of the Apostles, but they preached to the winds, and the same principle that weakens the effect must temper the abuse of the thunders of the Vatican. The love of ancient freedom has encouraged a belief that as early as the 10th century, in their first struggles against the Saxon Othos, the Commonwealth was vindicated and restored by the Senate and people of Rome, that 2 consuls were annually elected among the nobles, and that 10 or 12 plebeian magistrates revived the name and office of the tribunes of the commons. But this venerable structure disappears before the light of criticism. In the darkness of the Middle Ages, the appellations of senators, of consuls, of the sons of consuls, may sometimes be discovered. They were bestowed by the emperors or assumed by the most powerful citizens to denote their rank, their honors, and perhaps the claim of a pure and patrician descent; but they float on the surface, without a series or a substance, the titles of men, not the orders of government; and it is only from the year of Christ 1144 that the establishment of the Senate is dated, as a glorious era in the acts of the city. A new constitution was hastily framed by private ambition or popular enthusiasm, nor could Rome, in the 12th century, produce an antiquary to explain, or a legislator to restore, the harmony and proportions of the ancient model. The assembly of a free, of an armed people will ever speak in loud and weighty acclamations, but the regular distribution of the 55 tribes the nice balance of the wealth and numbers of the centuries, the debates of the adverse orators, and the slow operations of votes and ballots, could not easily be adapted by a blind multitude, ignorant of the arts, and insensible of the benefits of legal government. It was proposed by Arnold to revive and discriminate the equestrian order, but what could be the motive or measure of such distinction? The pecuniary qualification of the knights must have been reduced to the poverty of the times. Those times no longer required their civil functions of judges and farmers of the revenue, and their primitive duty, their military service on horseback, was more nobly supplied by feudal tenures and the spirit of chivalry. The jurisprudence of the republic was useless and unknown. The nations and families of Italy, who lived under the Roman and barbaric laws, were insensibly mingled in a common mass, and some faint tradition, some imperfect fragments, preserved the memory of the code and pandects of Justinian. With their liberty the Romans might doubtless have restored the appellation and office of consuls, had they not disdained a title so promiscuously adopted in the Italian cities, that it has finally settled on the humble station of the agents of commerce in a foreign land. But the rights of the tribunes, the formidable word that arrested the public consuls, suppose or must produce a legitimate democracy. The old patricians were the subjects, the modern barons the tyrants, of the state, nor would the enemies of peace and order, who insulted the vicar of Christ, have long respected the unarmed sanctity of a plebeian magistrate. In the revolution of the 12th century, which gave a new existence and era to Rome, we may observe the real and important events that marked or confirmed her political independence. First, the Capitolian Hill, one of her 7 eminences, is about 400 yards in length and 200 in breadth. A flight of 100 steps led to the summit of the Tarpeian Rock, and far steeper was the ascent before the declivities had been smoothed and the precipices filled by the ruins of fallen edifices. From the earliest ages the Capitol had been used as a temple in peace, a fortress in war. After the loss of the city it maintained a siege against the victorious Gauls, and the sanctuary of the empire was occupied, assaulted and burned, in the civil wars of Vitellus and Vespasian. The temples of Jupiter and his kindred deities had crumbled into dust; their place was supplied by monasteries and houses, and the solid walls, the long and shelving porticos, were decayed or ruined by the lapse of time. It was the first act of the Romans, an act of freedom, to restore the strength, though not the beauty, of the Capitol, to fortify the seat of their arms and councils; and as often as they ascended the hill, the coldest minds must have glowed with the remembrance of their ancestors. Second, the first Caesars had been invested with the exclusive coinage of the gold and silver; to the senate they abandoned the baser metal of bronze or copper. The emblems and legends were inscribed on a more ample field by the genius of flattery, and the prince was relieved from the care of celebrating his own virtues. The successors of Diocletian despised even the flattery of the senate; their royal officers at Rome and in the provinces assumed the sole direction of the mint; and the same prerogative was inherited by the Gothic kings of Italy, and the long series of the Greek, the French, and the German dynasties. After an abdication of 800 years, the Roman Senate asserted this honorable and lucrative privilege, which was tacitly renounced by the popes, from Paschal II to the establishment of the residence beyond the Alps. Some of these republican coins of the 12th and 13th centuries are shown in the cabinets of the curious. On one of these, a gold medal, Christ is depictured holding in his left hand a book with this inscription: "The woe of the Roman Senate and people, Rome the capital of the world." On the reverse, St. Peter delivering a banner to a kneeling senator in his cap and gown, with the name and arms of his family impressed on a shield. Third, With the empire, the prefect of the city had declined to a municipal officer, yet he still exercised in the last appeal the civil and criminal jurisdiction, and a drawn sword, which he received from the successors of Otho, was the mode of his investiture and the emblem of his functions. The dignity was confined to the noble families of Rome; the choice of the people was ratified by the pope; but a triple oath of fidelity must have often embarrassed the prefect in the conflict of adverse duties. A servant in whom they possessed but a third share was dismissed by the independent Romans; in his place they elected a patrician; but this title, which Charlemagne had not disdained, was too lofty for a citizen or a subject; and, after the first fervor or rebellion, they consented without reluctance to the restoration of the prefect. About 50 years after this event, Innocent III., the most ambitious, or at least the most fortunate, of the pontiffs, delivered the Romans and himself from this badge of foreign dominion. He invested the prefect with a banner instead of a sword, and absolved him from all dependence of oath or service to the German emperors. In his place an ecclesiastical, a present or future cardinal, was named by the pope to the civil government of Rome; but his jurisdiction has been reduced to a narrow compass, and in the days of freedom the right or exercise was derived from the senate and people. 4. After the revival of the senate, the conscript fathers, if I may use the expression, were invested with the legislative and executive power, but their views seldom reached beyond the present day, and that day was most frequently disturbed by violence and tumult. In its utmost plenitude, the order or assembly consisted of 56 senators, the most eminent of whom were distinguished by the title of councillors. They were nominated, perhaps annually, by the people, and a previous choice of their electors, 10 persons in each region, or parish, might afford a basis for a free and permanent constitution. The popes, who in this tempest submitted rather to bend than to break, confirmed by treaty the establishment and privileges of the senate, and expected from time, peace, and religion the restoration of their government. The motives of public and private interest might sometimes draw from the Romans an occasional and temporary sacrifice of their claims, and they renewed their oath of allegiance to the successor of St. Peter and Constantine, the lawful head of the church and the republic. The union and vigor of a public council was dissolved in a lawless city, and the Romans soon adopted a more strong and simple mode of administration. They condensed the name and authority of the senate in a single magistrate or 2 colleagues, and as they were changed at the end of a year or of 6 months, the greatness of the trust was compensated by the shortness of the term. But in this transient reign the senators of Rome indulged their avarice and ambition; their justice was perverted by the interest of their family and faction, and as they punished only their enemies, they were obeyed only by their adherents. Anarchy, no longer tempered by the pastoral care of their bishop, admonished the Romans that they were incapable of governing themselves, and they sought abroad those blessings which they were hopeless of finding at home. In the same age, and from the same motives, most of the Italian republics were prompted to embrace a measure which, however strange it may seem, was adapted to their situation, and productive of the most salutary effects. They chose, in some foreign but friendly city, an impartial magistrate of noble birth and unblemished character, a soldier and a statesman, recommended by the voice of fame and his country, to whom they delegated for a time the supreme administration of peace and war. The compact between the governor and the governed was sealed with oaths and subscriptions, and the duration of his power, the measure of his stipend, the nature of their mutual obligations, were defined with scrupulous precision. They swore to obey him as their lawful superior; he pledged his faith to unite the indifference of a stranger with the zeal of a patriot. At his choice 4 or 6 knights and civilians, his assessors in arms and justice, attended the podesta, who maintained at his own expense a decent retinue of servants and horses, his wife, his son, his brother, who might bias the affections of the judge, were left behind. During the exercise of his office he was not permitted to purchase land, to contract an alliance, or even to accept an invitation in the house of a citizen; nor could he honourably depart till he had satisfied the complaints that might be urged against his government. End of chapter 69, part 2. Chapter 69, part 3, of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 69, part 3. It was thus, about the middle of the 13th century, that the Romans called from Bologna the Senator Brancialeone, whose fame and merit have been rescued from oblivion by the pen of an English historian. A just anxiety for his reputation, a clear foresight of the difficulties of the task, had engaged him to refuse the honor of their choice. The statutes of Rome were suspended, and his office prolonged to the term of 3 years. By the guilty and licentious he was accused as cruel; by the clergy he was suspected as partial; but the friends of peace and order applauded the firm and upright magistrate by whom those blessings were restored. No criminals were so powerful as to brave, so obscure as to elude, the justice of the senator. By his sentence 2 nobles of the Annibaldi family were executed on a gibbet, and he inexorably demolished, in the city and neighborhood, 140 towers, the strong shelters of rapine and mischief. The bishop, as a simple bishop, was compelled to reside in his diocese, and the standard of Brancialeone was displayed in the field with terror and effect. His services were repaid by the ingratitude of the people unworthy of the happiness which they enjoyed. By the public robbers, whom he had provoked for their sake, the Romans were excited to depose and imprison their benefactor; nor would his life have been spared if Bologna had not possessed a pledge for his safety. Before his departure the prudent senator had required the exchange of 30 hostages of the noblest families of Rome. On the news of his danger, and at the prayer of his wife, they were more strictly guarded, and Bologna, in the cause of honor, sustained the thunders of a papal interdict. This generous resistance allowed the Romans to compare the present with the past, and Brancialeone was conducted from the prison to the Capitol amidst the acclamations of a repentant people. The remainder of his government was firm and fortunate, and as soon as envy was appeased by death, his head, enclosed in a precious vase, was deposited on a lofty column of marble. The impotence of reason and virtue recommended in Italy a more effectual choice. Instead of a private citizen, to whom they yielded a voluntary and precarious obedience, the Romans elected for their senator some prince of independent power, who could defend them from their enemies and themselves. Charles of Anjou and Provence, the most ambitious and warlike monarch of the age, accepted at the same time the kingdom of Naples from the pope, and the office of senator from the Roman people. As he passed through the city in his road to victory, he received their oath of allegiance, lodged in the Lateran palace, and smoothed in a short visit the harsh features of his despotic character. Yet even Charles was exposed to the inconstancy of the people, who saluted with the same acclamations the passage of his rival, the unfortunate Conradin; and a powerful avenger, who reigned in the capital, alarmed the fears and jealousy of the popes. The absolute term of his life was superseded by a renewal every 3rd year, and the enmity of Nicholas III. Obliged the Sicilian king to abdicate the government of Rome. In his bull, a perpetual law, the imperious pontiff asserts the truth, validity, and use of the donation of Constantine, not less essential to the peace of the city than to the independence of the Church, establishes the annual election of the senator, and formally disqualifies all emperors, kings, princes, and persons of an eminent and conspicuous rank. This prohibitory clause was repealed in his own behalf by Martin IV., who humbly solicited the suffrage of the Romans. In the presence, and by the authority of the people, two electors conferred, not on the pope, but on the noble and faithful Martin, the dignity of senator and the supreme administration of the republic, to hold during his natural life, and to exercise at pleasure by himself or his deputies. About 50 years afterwards, the same title was granted to the Emperor Lewis of Bavaria, and the liberty of Rome was acknowledged by her two sovereigns, who accepted a municipal office in the government of their own metropolis. In the first moments of rebellion, when Arnold of Brescia had inflamed their minds against the Church, the Romans artfully labored to conciliate the favor of the empire, and to recommend their merit and services in the cause of Caesar. The style of their ambassadors to Conrad III. And Frederick I. is a mixture of flattery and pride, the tradition and the ignorance of their own history. After some complaint of his silence and neglect, they exhort the former of these princes to pass the Alps, and assume from their hands the imperial crown. We beseech your Majesty not to disdain the humility of your sons and vassals, not to listen to the accusations of our common enemies, who calumniate the senate as hostile to your throne, who sow the seeds of discord, that they may reap the harvest of destruction. The pope and the Sicilian are united in an impious league to oppose our liberty and your coronation. With the blessing of God, our zeal and courage has hitherto defeated their attempts. Of their powerful and factious adherents, more especially the Frangipani, we have taken by assault the houses and turrets; some of these are occupied by our troops, and some are levelled with the ground. The Milvian bridge, which they had broken, is restored and fortified for your safe passage, and your army may enter the city without being annoyed from the castle of St. Angelo. All that we have done, and all that we design, is for your honor and service, in the loyal hope that you will speedily appear in person to vindicate these rights which have been invaded by the clergy, to revive the dignity of the empire, and to surpass the fame and glory of your predecessors. May you fix your residence in Rome, the capital of the world, give laws to Italy and the Teutonic kingdom, and imitate the example of Constantine and Justinian, who by the vigor of the senate and people obtained the sceptre of the earth. But these splendid and fallacious wishes were not cherished by Conrad the Franconian, whose eyes were fixed on the Holy Land, and who died without visiting Rome soon after his return from the Holy Land. His nephew and successor, Frederick Barbarossa, was more ambitious of the imperial crown, nor had any of the successors of Otho acquired such absolute sway over the kingdom of Italy. Surrounded by his ecclesiastical and secular princes, he gave audience in his camp at Sutri to the ambassadors of Rome, who thus addressed him in a free and florid oration: "Incline your ear to the Queen of Cities. Approach with a peaceful and friendly mind the precincts of Rome, which has cast away the yoke of the clergy, and is impatient to crown her legitimate emperor. Under your auspicious influence may the primitive times be restored. Assert the prerogatives of the Eternal City, and reduce under her monarchy the insolence of the world. You are not ignorant that, in a former age, by the wisdom of the senate, by the valor and discipline of the equestrian order, she extended her victorious arms to the east and west, beyond the Alps, and over the islands of the ocean. By our sins, in the absence of our princes, the noble institution of the senate has sunk in oblivion, and with our prudence our strength has likewise decreased. We have revived the senate and the equestrian order; the counsels of the one, the arms of the other, will be devoted to your person and the service of the empire. Do you not hear the language of the Roman matron? You were guest; I have adopted you as a citizen, a transalpine stranger; I have elected you for my sovereign, and given you myself and all that is mine. Your first and most sacred duty is to swear and subscribe that you will shed your blood for the republic, that you will maintain in peace and justice the laws of the city and the charters of your predecessors, and that you will reward with 5,000 pounds of silver the faithful senators who shall proclaim your titles in the Capitol. With the name assume the character of Augustus. The flowers of Latin rhetoric were not yet exhausted, but Frederick, impatient of their vanity, interrupted the orators in the high tone of royalty and conquest. Famous indeed have been the fortitude and wisdom of the ancient Romans, but your speech is not seasoned with wisdom, and I could wish that fortitude were conspicuous in your actions. Like all sublunary things, Rome has felt the vicissitudes of time and fortune. Your noblest families were translated to the East, to the royal city of Constantine, and the remains of your strength and freedom have long since been exhausted by the Greeks and Franks. Are you desirous of beholding the ancient glory of Rome, the gravity of the senate, the spirit of the knights, the discipline of the camp, the valor of the legions? You will find them in the German Republic. It is not empire naked and alone. The ornaments and virtues of empire have likewise migrated beyond the Alps to a more deserving people. They will be employed in your defense, but they claim your obedience. You pretend that myself or my predecessors have been invited by the Romans. You mistake the word. They were not invited, they were implored. From its foreign and domestic tyrants, the city was rescued by Charlemagne and Otho, whose ashes repose in our country, and their dominion was the price of your deliverance. Under that dominion your ancestors lived and died. I claim by the right of inheritance and possession, and who shall dare to extort you from my hands? Is the hand of the Franks and Germans enfeebled by age? Am I vanquished? Am I a captive? Am I not encompassed with the banners of a potent and invincible army? You impose conditions on your master. You require oaths. If the conditions are just, an oath is superfluous; if unjust, it is criminal. Can you doubt my equity? It is extended to the meanest of my subjects. Will not my sword be unsheathed in the defense of the capital? By that sword the northern kingdom of Denmark has been restored to the Roman Empire. You prescribe the measure and the objects of my bounty, which flows in a copious but a voluntary stream. All will be given to patient merit, all will be denied to rude importunity. Neither the emperor nor the senate could maintain these lofty pretensions of dominion and liberty. United with the pope, and suspicious of the Romans, Frederick continued his march to the Vatican. His coronation was disturbed by a sally from the capital, and if the numbers and valor of the Germans prevailed in the bloody conflict, he could not safely encamp in the presence of a city of which he styled himself the sovereign. About 12 years afterwards, he besieged Rome, to seat an antipope in the chair of St. Peter, and 12 Pisan galleys were introduced into the Tiber; but the senate and people were saved by the arts of negotiation and the progress of disease, nor did Frederick or his successors reiterate the hostile attempt. Their laborious reigns were exercised by the popes, the crusades, and the independence of Lombardy and Germany. They courted the alliance of the Romans, and Frederick II. Offered in the capital the great standard, the Carroccio of Milan. After the extinction of the house of Swabia, they were banished beyond the Alps, and their last coronations betrayed the impotence and poverty of the Teutonic Caesars. Under the reign of Adrian, when the empire extended from the Euphrates to the ocean, from Mount Atlas to the Grampian hills, a fanciful historian amused the Romans with the picture of their ancient wars. There was a time, says Florus, when Tibur and Praeneste, our summer retreats, were the objects of hostile woes in the capital, when we dreaded the shades of the Arician groves, when we could triumph without a blush over the nameless villages of the Sabines and Latins, and even Corioli could afford a title not unworthy of a victorious general. The pride of his contemporaries was gratified by the contrast of the past and the present. they would have been humbled by the prospect of futurity, by the prediction that after 1,000 years, Rome, despoiled of empire and contracted to her primeval limits, would renew the same hostilities, on the same ground which was then decorated with her villas and gardens. The adjacent territory on either side of the Tiber was always claimed, and sometimes possessed, as the patrimony of St. Peter; but the barons assumed a lawless independence, and the cities too faithfully copied the revolt and discord of the metropolis. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Romans incessantly labored to reduce or destroy the contumacious vassals of the church and senate; and if their headstrong and selfish ambition was moderated by the pope, he often encouraged their zeal by the alliance of his spiritual arms. Their warfare was that of the first consuls and dictators, who were taken from the plough. They assembled in arms at the foot of the Capitol, sallied from the gates, plundered or burned the harvests of their neighbors, engaged in tumultuary conflict, and returned home after an expedition of 15 or 20 days. Their sieges were tedious and unskilful; in the use of victory they indulged the meaner passions of jealousy and revenge, and instead of adopting the valor, they trampled on the misfortunes, of their adversaries. The captives in their shirts, with a rope around their necks, solicited their pardon; the fortifications, and even the buildings of the rival cities, were demolished, and the inhabitants were scattered in the adjacent villages. It was thus that the seats of the cardinal bishops, Porto, Ostia, Albanum, Tusculum, Praeneste, and Tibur or Tivoli, were successively overthrown by the ferocious hostility of the Romans. Of these, Porto and Ostia, the two keys of the Tiber, are still vacant and desolate; the marshy and unwholesome banks are peopled with herds of buffaloes, and the river is lost to every purpose of navigation and trade. The hills, which afford a shady retirement from the autumnal heats, have again smiled with the blessings of peace; Frescati has arisen near the ruins of Tusculum; Tibur or Tivoli has resumed the honors of a city; and the meaner towns of Albano and Palestrina are decorated with the villas of the cardinals and princes of Rome. In the work of destruction, the ambition of the Romans was often checked and repulsed by the neighboring cities and their allies. In the first siege of Tibur they were driven from their camp, and the battles of Tusculum and Viterbo might be compared in their relative state to the memorable fields of Trasimene and Cannae. In the first of these petty wars, 30,000 Romans were overthrown by 1,000 German horse, whom Frederick Barbarossa had detached to the relief of Tusculum; and if we number the slain at 3, the prisoners at 2,000, we shall embrace the most authentic and moderate account. 68 years afterwards they marched against Viterbo in the ecclesiastical state, with the whole force of the city; by a rare coalition the Teutonic eagle was blended, in the adverse banners, with the keys of St. Peter, and the pope's auxiliaries were commanded by a count of Toulouse and a bishop of Winchester. The Romans were discomfited with shame and slaughter; but the English prelate must have indulged the vanity of a pilgrim if he multiplied their numbers to 100 and their loss in the field to 30,000 men. Had the policy of the senate and the discipline of the legions been restored with the Capitol, the divided condition of Italy would have offered the fairest opportunity of a second conquest. But in arms the modern Romans were not above, and in arts they were far below, the common level of the neighboring republics. Nor was their warlike spirit of any long continuance; after some irregular sallies, they subsided in the national apathy, in the neglect of military institutions, and in the disgraceful and dangerous use of foreign mercenaries. Ambition is a weed of quick and early vegetation in the vineyard of Christ. Under the first Christian princes, the chair of St. Peter was disputed by the votes, the venality, the violence, of a popular election; the sanctuaries of Rome were polluted with blood; and, from the 3rd to the 12th century, the church was distracted by the mischief of frequent schisms. As long as the final appeal was determined by the civil magistrate, these mischiefs were transient and local; the merits were tried by equity or favor, nor could the unsuccessful competitor long disturb the triumph of his rival. But after the emperors had been divested of their prerogatives, after a maxim had been established that the vicar of Christ is amenable to no earthly tribunal, each vacancy of the holy seat might involve Christendom in controversy and war. The claims of the cardinals and inferior clergy, of the nobles and people, were vague and litigious. The freedom of choice was overruled by the tumults of a city that no longer owned or obeyed a superior. On the decease of a pope, two factions proceeded in different churches to a double election. The number and weight of votes, the priority of time, the merit of the candidates, might balance each other; the most respectable of the clergy were divided, and the distant princes who bowed before the spiritual throne could not distinguish the spurious from the legitimate idol. The emperors were often the authors of the schism, from the political motive of opposing a friendly to a hostile pontiff, and each of the competitors was reduced to suffer the insults of his enemies who were not awed by conscience, and to purchase the support of his adherents who were instigated by avarice or ambition. A peaceful and perpetual succession was ascertained by Alexander III, who finally abolished the tumultuary votes of the clergy and people, and defined the right of election in the sole college of cardinals. The three orders of bishops, priests, and deacons were assimilated to each other by this important privilege. The parochial clergy of Rome obtained the first rank in the hierarchy; they were indifferently chosen among the nations of Christendom, and the possession of the richest benefices of the most important bishoprics was not incompatible with their title and office. The senators of the Catholic Church, the coadjutors and legates of the supreme pontiff, were robed in purple, the symbol of martyrdom or royalty; they claimed a proud equality with kings, and their dignity was enhanced by the smallest of their number, which, till the reign of Leo X, seldom exceeded 20 or 25 persons. By this wise regulation all doubt and scandal were removed, and the root of schism was so effectually destroyed that in the period of 600 years a double choice has only once divided the unity of the Sacred College. But as the concurrence of two thirds of the votes had been made necessary, the election was often delayed by the private interest and passions of the cardinals; and while they prolonged their independent reign, the Christian world was left destitute of a head. A vacancy of almost 3 years had preceded the elevation of George X, who resolved to prevent the future abuse; and his bull, after some opposition, has been consecrated in the code of the canon law. 9 days are allowed for the obsequies of the deceased pope, and the arrival of the absent cardinals; on the 10th, they are imprisoned, each with one domestic, in a common apartment or conclave, without any separation of walls or curtains; a small window is reserved for the introduction of necessaries, but the door is locked on both sides and guarded by the magistrates of the city, to seclude them from all correspondence with the world. If the election be not consummated in 3 days, the luxury of their table is contracted to a single dish at dinner and supper, and after the 8th day they are reduced to a scanty allowance of bread, water, and wine. During the vacancy of the Holy See, the cardinals are prohibited from touching the revenues, or assuming, unless in some rare emergency, the government of the Church. All agreements and promises among the electors are formally annulled, and their integrity is fortified by their solemn oath and the prayers of the Catholics. Some articles of inconvenient or superfluous rigor have been gradually relaxed, but the principle of confinement is vigorous and entire. They are still urged, by the personal motives of health and freedom, to accelerate the moment of their deliverance, and the improvement of ballot or secret votes has wrapped the struggles of the conclave in the silky veil of charity and politeness. By these institutions the Romans were excluded from the election of their prince and bishop, and in the fever of wild and precarious liberty they seemed insensible of the loss of this inestimable privilege. The Emperor Louis of Bavaria revived the example of his great Otho. After some negotiation with the magistrates, the Roman people were assembled in the square before St. Peter's. The Pope of Avignon, John XXII., was deposed. The choice of his successor was ratified by their consent and applause. They freely voted for a new law, that their bishop should never be absent more than 3 months in the year, and 2 days' journey from the city; and that if he neglected to return on the third summons, the public servant should be degraded and dismissed. But Louis forgot his own debility and the prejudices of the time. Beyond the precincts of a German camp, his useless phantom was rejected; the Romans despised their own workmanship; the anti pope implored the mercy of his lawful sovereign; and the exclusive right of the cardinals was more firmly established by this unseasonable attack. Had the election been always held in the Vatican, the rights of the senate and people would not have been violated with impunity. But the Romans forgot, and were forgotten, in the absence of the successors of Gregory VII., who did not keep as a divine precept their ordinary residence in the city and diocese. The care of the diocese was less important than the government of the universal church; nor could the popes delight in a city in which their authority was always opposed, and their person was often endangered. From the persecution of the emperors and the wars of Italy, they escaped beyond the Alps into the hospitable bosom of France. From the tumults of Rome they prudently withdrew, to live and die in the more tranquil stations of Anagni, Perugia, Viterbo, and the adjacent cities. When the flock was offended or impoverished by the absence of the shepherd, they were recalled by a stern admonition that St. Peter had fixed his chair, not in an obscure village, but in the capital of the world; by a ferocious menace that the Romans would march in arms to destroy the place and people that should dare to afford them a retreat. They returned with timorous obedience, and were saluted with the account of a heavy debt, of all the losses which their desertion had occasioned, the hire of lodgings, the sale of provisions, and the various expenses of servants and strangers who attended the court. After a short interval of peace, and perhaps of authority, they were again banished by new tumults, and again summoned by the imperious or respectful invitation of the senate. In these occasional retreats, the exiles and fugitives of the Vatican were seldom long or far distant from the metropolis; but in the beginning of the 14th century, the apostolic throne was transported, as it might seem forever, from the Tiber to the Rhone, and the cause of the transmigration may be deduced from the furious contest between Boniface VIII. And the King of France. The spiritual arms of excommunication and interdict were repulsed by the union of the three estates, and the privileges of the Gallican church; but the pope was not prepared against the carnal weapons which Philip the Fair had courage to employ. As the pope resided at Anagni, without the suspicion of danger, his palace and person were assaulted by 300 horse, who had been secretly levied by William of Nogaret, a French minister, and Sciarra Colonna, of a noble but hostile family of Rome. The cardinals fled; the inhabitants of Anagni were seduced from their allegiance and gratitude; but the dauntless Boniface, unarmed and alone, seated himself in his chair and awaited, like the conscript fathers of old, the swords of the Gauls. Nogaret, a foreign adversary, was content to execute the orders of his master; by the domestic enmity of Colonna he was insulted with words and blows, and during a confinement of 3 days his life was threatened by the hardships which they inflicted on the obstinacy which they provoked. Their strange delay gave time and courage to the adherents of the church, who rescued him from sacrilegious violence; but his imperious soul was wounded in the vital part, and Boniface expired at Rome in a frenzy of rage and revenge. His memory is stained with the glaring vices of avarice and pride; nor has the courage of a martyr promoted this ecclesiastical champion to the honors of a saint. A magnanimous sinner, say the chronicles of the times, who entered like a fox, reigned like a lion, and died like a dog. He was succeeded by Benedict XI., the mildest of mankind. Yet he excommunicated the impious emissaries of Philip, and devoted the city and people of Anagni by a tremendous curse, whose effects are still visible to the eyes of superstition. CHAPTER 69.